Hey, we're going to get started in just a moment. We're just going to wait a little bit while folks enter into our webinar. Good. All right. Well, I am delighted to welcome you to Columbia Ethics Grand Rounds. I'm Sandra Sujin Lee, a professor of medical humanities and ethics and chief of the Division of Ethics at Columbia. Uh, I am really excited about today's Grand Rounds, which is entitled A Great Friendship, the Evolution of the Government University Science Partnership in the United States. For those of you new to Ethics Grand Rounds, this is a monthly series organized by the Division of Ethics in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics here at VPNS at Columbia University. And the goal of Ethics Grand Rounds is to engage our community of health professionals, scholars, scientists, and trainees across career stages and disciplines by centering important topics and debates in medical ethics that relate to clinical practice, research, and education. And our hope is that attendees will leave each session with a greater understanding of the ethical and social implications of the topics discussed. This is a series that is co-led by Lucas Matthews, an assistant professor in our Division of Ethics, with the support of our dedicated organizing committee of faculty, research staff, and program administrators, whose dedication I am extremely grateful for. Before I turn to our topic for today, I'd like to remind our audience online to please check the chat for logistics and other information for this session. This is a reminder that today's session is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded as a resource to the Columbia Division of Ethics website following the event. You'll receive a link to the recording once it's available. Also, immediately following this 1-hour webinar, there will be a 30-minute after party in a separate Zoom room. You can join us there to continue the conversation, ask questions that we didn't get to, and connect with our speaker and each other. A separate Zoom link for that after party session will be posted in the chat at the end of the event. Now, to focus on today's Ethics Grand Rounds, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the seismic shift that is now unfolding in the landscape of biomedical research funding that has impacted so many directly and certainly our own institution. Just last week, the Journal of American Medical Association reported that nearly 700 NIH grants totaling over 1.8 billion have been terminated since late February. These cuts, amounting to about 3.3% of the NIH total operating budget, have not been evenly distributed. The National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, for example, has alone lost nearly 30% of its funding, which raises urgent questions about the future of research aimed at addressing longstanding health disparities. Even more sweeping changes may be on the horizon, and many of you are probably aware of the administration's proposed 2026 federal budget that includes a 40% reduction in the NIH budget from approximately 48 billion to 27 billion. At the same time, the National Science Foundation is facing a proposed 56% funding cut, and reports indicate that all 37 of its internal divisions may be slated or have already been eliminated. So this moment marks more than just a budgetary contraction. It signals a fundamental reconfiguration of how scientific knowledge will be produced, who will be trained to conduct it, and which institutions and sectors will be positioned to shape its direction. These are not only policy questions, but deeply ethical ones, with profound implications that bear heavily on human lives across national borders. To help us think historically and critically about how we arrived at this juncture, we're very fortunate to be joined by Professor Jonathan Engel. Dr. Engel is professor of public policy at the Mark School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College at CUNY. with an appointment in health policy and management here at Columbia's Mailman School. His work traces the historical evolution of U.S. health and science policy, and his most recent book, Transforming American Science, Universities, the Government, and the Cold War, provides an essential lens on how federal funding reshaped the research cultures of American universities. So I encourage you to read the book. You're going to hear certainly a lot in today's presentation. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and welcome Professor Jonathan Engel.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you everyone for coming today. I'm really, really honored to be invited to do this. Just a little bit about myself. I have an odd background. My doctoral work was in history of science and medicine. I'm a PhD trained historian, but I've never actually worked in a history department. I've always taught public policy and management. I have an MBA in finance, of all the weird things, and I've always wound up teaching healthcare policy and healthcare management. But my research tends to be historical, trying to understand the historical evolution of the system, whether it's healthcare delivery, mental health. I wrote a whole book on the AIDS epidemic. I wrote a book on obesity. This book was on science policy, and my current work is on anti-poverty work in the 1940s and 50s. So this is a really, really interesting moment in scientific research and scientific funding, obviously, and we faced really cataclysmic cuts. And as Sandra just suggested, this is more than simply a budget reduction. This is a fundamental reorientation of the whole role of universities in the production of new scientific knowledge. It's really quite extraordinary what's going on. It may or may not be bad. We're sort of unique in this country in the way we fund science and in this rather unique partnership that American government has with American universities. Other countries don't do it this way. I'll just let you know, Germany does not do it this way, and Japan doesn't do it this way. We're sort of unique. But I will argue that I think what we've done here is really quite remarkable. I think we've been uniquely successful. And in fact, I'm going to give you some statistics to really prove that we've been uniquely successful. And I think there are reasons why our system of government funding of university-based science has been so successful. I think there are really strong cultural reasons that argue for this. It's not an obvious relationship, but it really has been quite a remarkable relationship. A number of people have asked over the last month or two, as we talk about cutting hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of dollars of federal funding from various universities. Well, these are very, very rich universities. After all, Harvard University is sitting on just an almost obscenely large endowment of some $52 to $54 billion, depending on market conditions that day. Columbia is not bad itself. Columbia is one of the wealthiest universities in the world with about $14 billion. Stanford has about $30 billion. MIT has about $20 billion. These are enormous sums of money. And really only Oxford and Cambridge can compete around the world. Nothing looks like American rich private universities, except, as I say, maybe Oxford and Cambridge. And so a lot of people have said, well, why can't these universities just dig into their pocketbooks? Why can't they open up their bank accounts? And what I want to show you today, forget about the limitations. There's been talk in the media about sort of restrictions on the use of these funds, and there is truth about that. But I also want to show you that outside of Harvard, and Harvard is really sui generis, it's actually twice as rich as the next richest American university. It's twice as rich as Stanford, right? And even Harvard can't really do this. It can do this for a little while, but it can't really do it for long. That $700 million figure we keep hearing about Harvard actually understates it by almost 2/3. The real amount of money, of federal money going into Harvard research, including Harvard's affiliated hospitals, is actually closer to $2 billion. And then I'm going to make a point that as rich as Harvard is, it cannot replace $2 billion in lost federal funds. And certainly Columbia, as rich as it is, cannot begin to replace lost federal funds. When we look at places like Michigan or Hopkins, we'll realize nothing can replace this amount of funding. If we insist on cutting this amount of funding, what we'll find is a very, very different scientific research complex. It's going to look very different. And I hope you'll walk along with me today to understand how we got here, why we produce this kinds of firmament. So I'm going to share some slides. Of course, that's what professors do. So I want to let's just start right here with our own Columbia Medical School. The official name of Columbia Medical School is the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. It's the oldest medical school in the United States. It was the College of Physicians and Surgeons. until Mr. Vagelos gave a very, very large gift. We're all very grateful to that. Now it's the Vagelos College. And it sits, as all medical schools do, as an independent school within a larger university. We do have a handful of independent medical schools in this country. But for the most part, they're university affiliated, albeit with a great deal of independence. So I want us to walk back for a second to try to understand what Columbia Medical School is. And I just want to say Columbia Medical School exemplifies a typical research active medical school. It's a top 10 medical school. It looks a lot like other top 10 medical schools. In fact, it looks a lot like top 25 or 30 medical schools. There's only about 150 medical schools in the country. So they tend to look this way. So I want to start by saying we all know what medical schools do is they take in medical students. They also actually take in doctoral students and some master's students. Right now, Columbia has 560 students studying for the MD degree. They take in about 140 each year. So there's 560. They almost all graduate. They're very, very bright and talented. And Columbia Medical School also has about another 640 students studying for either an MA or a PhD. So this is an important part of the work that the school does. So altogether, the school has roughly 1,200 students. So what do you usually need? Well, typical staffing for a very, very good university is roughly a 10-to-1 student-faculty ratio. That is, you want roughly, at the very best schools, we tend to think of one professor for each 10 students. At lesser universities, we tend to think of it as more like 1-to-20 or 1-to-25. A typical American high school has about a 1-to-25 ratio if we knock out the special ed programs. A very wealthy liberal arts college might have a 1-to-15 ratio, but let's call it 1-to-10 today. So a school with 1,200 students would then require 100 faculty members, right? 12-to-1 ratio. You need 100 professors to teach 1,200 students. Well, how many of you know, in fact, how many professors there are at Columbia Medical School? How many full-time professors there are? There are not 100 full-time professors. There are, in fact, almost 2,700 full-time professors, 2,636. I looked up the last tally to be exact. So that should make unless you really know something about medical schools, that should make your jaw drop. You should say, how is that possible that a school with 1,200 students has 2,600 full-time faculty with benefits, right? I'm not talking about part-time faculty. I'm not talking about adjunct faculty, guest lecturers, people who come in to supervise a series of residents for a couple hours a week. No, these are full-time people drawing their full-time salary and benefits and tenure and health insurance and retirement off of Columbia. 2,600 faculty for 1,200 students. And so what that should tell you is this is not a school in the way that we traditionally think of a school, right? Traditionally, we think of schools as people pay tuition and they engage in tutorial and they're taught by faculty, right? But clearly that's not what's happening here. That's not what these professors are doing. And in fact, that's really not what the professors are doing. Columbia Medical School faculty, like medical school faculty at most medical schools, are spending very, very little time teaching. In fact, at a typical university, which is somewhat research active, we tend to think of a 40-40-20 split, where professors spend about 40% of their time on teaching, 40% of their time on research, and 20% of their time on administrative work, what they sometimes call service. I call it committee work, right? 40-40-20 split. And at a more research-intensive university, that might more go down to like a 60-20-20 split, 60% research, 20% teaching, 20% committee work. But at a place like Columbia Medical School, it's closer to probably about a 98-2 split, about a 90% research effort, 8% committee work, and about 2% of teaching. That is, these 2,600 faculty at Columbia are not teaching. They're simply not teaching. There's a handful of core teaching faculty, but the vast majority are not teaching. And I really want to hammer that home, that this is not a school in the way we think of it as a school. And so what is it? This is essentially a research institute. That's what this is. And this is a research institute that's drawing the lion's share of its funding from the federal government. Not 100%. There's also some patient care coming in, and that's going to be an important part of the story. And there's a little teeny bit of state money coming. We'll look at that with the University of Michigan. And there's a little bit of money coming off of the private foundations, the Gates Foundation and the Simons Foundation and the American Heart Association and the American Lung Association. There's a little bit of money. But the lion's share is really coming in off of the federal government. And so what we've created here is not a school per se. It's an arm of the federal government. It's a research arm of the federal government. So when we talk about slashing the federal grant budget, we're really talking about putting an end to the school, because what the school is an arm of the federal research enterprise. And I really want to hammer that. This is not a decline or a pullback of 5 or 10 or 15%. This is a wholesale end of the model of what this school is. There is, because remember, I have an MBA in finance and accounting, so you knew there's going to be some numbers here. Take a look at that second to the right-hand column. That was the last fiscal year of Columbia University. These are publicly available numbers. Any nonprofit has to post its annual financials. Columbia's fiscal year runs, as many universities do, July to June. They cut off their fiscal year at the end of June. Makes a lot of sense. It's on an academic calendar. So you can see that Columbia University had a $6.6 billion budget last year, of which just about a quarter came in tuition. $1.5 billion came in tuition and fees. And Columbia does not own its hospital, but Columbia does own its large physician practice network. That is, many of those faculty up there at the medical school are also doing clinical work on behalf of Columbia as part of the Columbia Physicians Network. And that's bringing in $1.7 billion. So actually a little more than a quarter, closer to 30% of the budget is coming in off of patient care. And then this $813 million, that's what's coming in off the endowment, right? So Columbia is a very rich school. It has about a $14 billion endowment. Thank you to all those wealthy alumni who've been giving back gifts all these years, right? So roughly 20% of the budget is coming in off the endowment, right? Actually more like 17% of the budget. And look, this is the big number we want to look up here. $1.3 billion is coming in government contracts and grants. That's mostly federal, a teeny bit of state, but mostly federal, right? So if we knock off patient care, because a lot of schools don't have doctors actually seeing patients, right? We can see that almost half of this university's revenue is really coming in off of government grants and contracts. When we throw in private gifts, grants, and contracts, that's money coming in off of various foundations and some alumni donations. Now we're really up to the better part of 40% of the budget. So I really want to emphasize this cannot easily be made up. And that's with that $800 million coming in off of Columbia's endowment. Most schools don't have $800 million coming off their endowment. Columbia is among the 8 richest universities in America and among the 12 richest universities in the world. And it still can't really in any way begin to make up for its shortfall. Here's MIT. So we're going to walk through 3 or 4 of these schools. MIT looks different from Columbia because MIT doesn't have a medical school. MIT sometimes piggybacks on Harvard's medical school, and there's a joint PhD, MD program, but it doesn't have a medical school. But you'll see, and MIT, by the way, is also a very rich university. It has about a $20 billion endowment. And MIT is a very, very special and interesting place. For those of you who've never been there, I encourage you to go up. It doesn't quite look like anything else in America, and its history doesn't quite look like anything else in America. When we talk about the government university nexus, it was first and foremost MIT. MIT was really where this model was invented. And in the second half of today's talk, I'll really talk about the unique role that MIT played. So there you can see, this is just broken down by percentage, but direct sponsored support, that's grant money coming in almost entirely from the DoD, from the Department of Defense. It's coming in at 14%. And then 26% is coming in from the Air Force to the Lincoln Lab. So MIT has a quasi-national laboratory, and I'll talk about these national laboratories, which it runs, which is funded 100% from the U.S. Air Force. So about 40% of the entire MIT budget is coming in off of federal grants, and more importantly, I would say federal contracts, right? Grants and contracts are slightly different. Contracts is work for hire. The university doesn't actually own the data. The government would own that data. Grants, the researcher, him or herself, own the data and can then publish publicly in a peer-reviewed journal. Contracts generally produce classified work. You're not allowed to just take it and publish it. So 40% of the MIT budget is coming from the federal government. And you can see We all complain about how expensive these universities are, and MIT these days is charging the better part of $85,000 a year. But you can see that tuition is only bringing in 8% of the MIT budget, right? And you can also see that MIT is a very, very wealthy university. Almost a third of the budget is coming in off its endowment, right? So as wealthy as MIT is, again, one of the 10 wealthiest universities in the world, it can only produce just under 30% of its budget from its investments, and 40% of its budget has to come from the federal government if it is to continue to look like MIT. It would look like a very different place if it weren't doing this. If that federal support ended, you can see that there's simply no way in a sustainable way for that endowment to continue to support this institution, right? We would have to draw off more than double from the endowment each year, which would be unsustainable. Typical responsible use of endowment is about roughly a 3.5% to 4% draw per year. Just very, very quickly, I just want to tell you why. There's kind of a little bit of finance geekdom in here. Over the long haul, capital tends to earn about 7% a year, adjusting for inflation. Well, we're not adjusting for inflation. It tends to earn about 7% a year. Money invested in equities over the long haul. There's good years, there's bad years. We had a couple of 12 and 14% years. We had some very bad years. But over a long haul, if you look at about a 40, 50-year time horizon, capital tends to earn about 70% a year, unless you're Warren Buffett. And inflation over the long haul traditionally has been about 3% a year. We had about 20 years, these past 20 years, where it was low, it was about 2%, and then it zoomed up during the pandemic, during COVID, and now we've sort of largely gotten it back under control. But we tend to think of capital as earning 7%. 3% of that is robbed by inflation. At the end of the year, your endowment is worth essentially 3% less than it was at the beginning of the year because of the nature of inflation. So you can draw off 4% of that 7% and then invest the other 3% back in the principal to keep up with inflation. That's why 4% is almost always seen as a sustainable draw rate on a well-invested, secure endowment. You can't really go beyond that. Once you go beyond 4%, you're diminishing the purchasing power of your endowment. So you're undermining the strength of that endowment for future generations. And most institutions want to invest their endowment for future generations. There's been a fair number of people who said, well, isn't the point of an endowment a rainy day? And isn't this the rainy day? We have an administration in power right now that wants to drastically cut support of science efforts. And maybe this is the rainy day, right? Maybe a rainy day is a international pandemic, or a rainy day is a huge global war, or a rainy day is a very unusual administration with very destructive policies for universities. And that may be true. But you should know that the way these endowments have been used is not really a rainy day model. These endowments have largely been used as to supplement on a year-to-year basis the operating costs of the university. It allows the university to take in students need blind, to not have to really charge most of the students that kind of money. And it allows them to hire faculty who don't do a lot of teaching. Let's go back to our slides. Here's Johns Hopkins, and I always like to show Johns Hopkins. A quick little quiz here. When I ask people which university gets more federal funding than any other, and most people say, is it Stanford? Is it Harvard? Is it University of Michigan? Is it the University of is it University of California? And the answer is no, it's Johns Hopkins, and it's Johns Hopkins by a very large margin. In fact, Johns Hopkins gets more than twice as much federal funding as the second highest funded university in America. Johns Hopkins doesn't really look like anything else, and there's a reason why. There's two ways to make a lot of money from the federal government. You can have a medical school, a very research active medical school, in which case you're getting very large grants from the NIH. Or you can have a very large engineering school in which you're getting large contracts from the Pentagon and large grants from the National Science Foundation and the Naval Research Labs. Hopkins has both. It has, by many definitions or by many views, the preeminent medical school in the world in terms of the research prowess of its faculty. And it really has the preeminent government-supported applied research basis for the Pentagon. It really exceeds the scale of MIT. And you can see this. So there's tuition. The Johns Hopkins has almost a $9 billion budget, very, very large, of which about 851 million, so less than 10% came in off of tuition. 1.8 billion came in contracts and federal grants. That was largely to the medical school. And then you can see there that $2.5 billion came into the applied physics laboratory for a total of $4.8 billion in federally funded research. The Applied Physics Laboratory, I'll talk about it in a second. It's the largest government-sponsored university laboratory. It started during World War II. It now has almost 9,000 people working for it. Johns Hopkins is losing its mind. There is talk in the administration right now of cutting the entire funding for the Applied Physics Laboratory. That would be the loss of 9,000 full-time people for Johns Hopkins. It would fundamentally change the shape and silhouette of the university. So I just want you to get a feel for just the scale of what Hopkins is doing. And Johns Hopkins, because it actually owns its own hospital, is also pulling in about $1 billion in patient billings each year. There's the University of Michigan, just to show you a public university. By many measures, Michigan or California or Washington are sort of the preeminent research active public universities. Public universities tend to be larger. So Michigan has almost 40,000 students instead of 15 or 10,000 students. It has operating budget of $12 billion. And I want to show you something. Very, very little of that is actually coming from the state or from tuition. They're charging $2.3 billion in tuition, of which they give back $600 million in financial aid. So they're actually only netting $1.7 billion in tuition, of which nearly half is coming from the state, right? So they're getting relatively little money of kids' parents actually writing checks. Then they're pulling in $1.3 billion in federal grants. That's the largest of any state university, unless if you count the entire University of California complex as one, it's larger. But Michigan is more than any one campus of the University of California. And then you can see Michigan actually owns an enormous hospital. In fact, it owns a network of hospitals and a very large physician practice. So it's pulling in almost $8 billion in patient care. If we knock off the $8 million in patient care, if we really just look at Michigan as a university as opposed to a medical system, it's really a $4 billion budget, of which nearly, really over half between the $1.7 billion in federal grants, I'm sorry, the $1.3 billion in grants, and then some of the overhead coming in is just about half of their non-clinical budget. So again, Michigan would look very, very different if federal grants were cut off. This is a relatively recent model, this idea of a handful of extremely elite and powerful and vaunted research universities essentially becoming arms of the federal government, because that's what these universities are. Yes, they're teaching schools, and yes, they have football teams. And yes, they have undergraduates majoring in comp lit. But if you look at their budget, more than you want to believe, these are actually arms of the federal government. I want to make the case here that this has been a very, very successful model. Other countries don't do this. And what we've done has really paid dividends. So I put together a couple of fun and slightly tendentious statistics, but indulge me. It's a dangerous game to be ranking universities. By at least one ranking, about half of the world's top 50 research universities are American. Usually the way we usually rank that is by research citations. If you take a look at where people are getting cited and the faculty's impact score and their H score, there's all sorts of ways of quantifying the quality and impact and importance of faculty research. And if we aggregate all of those research metrics for any given university, about half of the world's top 50 research universities are in fact American, even though we're only 4% of the world's population. We're producing half of the best research universities in the world. Here's another fun one. Again, take this as you will, but I think it's a fun statistic. About 2/3 of Nobel Prizes in the sciences awarded since 1950 have gone to scientists affiliated with American universities, labs, and institutes. So that's extraordinary. Again, a country that has 4% of the world's population has produced 2/3 of the Nobel Prize winning research in science for the past 75 years. I mean, that really is an incredible run. It's actually slightly diminishing. Other countries are catching up. China is putting enormous amounts of money into research. Japan does very fine research. So does France. So does England. So does Germany. But really, the US for the last 70 years has been preeminent, really in a league by itself. Not all of these scientists are American citizens. Many of them are foreign citizens who have come to the United States to study and work at American universities. I think that accrues to our merit, right? I think it really accrues to our own credit, the fact that we can attract so many of the best people in the world to come and work in American universities. In a similar vein, 45% of the Fields Medal winners, that's kind of the Nobel Prize for math, have been affiliated with an American university, and 62% of the winners of the John Bates Clark Medal, that's kind of the baby Nobel in economics that goes to the best economists under age 40. Fully 62%, almost 2/3, have been economists working with an American university. So I just want us to think about those numbers. the staggering success of American research since the Second World War. Before the Second World War, it was all Germany and England, by the way, you should know. Once we got into this game and really put our financial might behind it, it's been all American. It's really been just an incredible show of American dominance in the highest levels of research. And again, I want to make the point that many, many of these winners and publishers and researchers have not been American citizens. They've been those, some of them became American citizens, they immigrated here, or they're people who chose to make their careers at American universities because the working conditions were so fruitful. There was so much funding. There was such a wealth of talent here and so much support. It was a uniquely productive environment in which to do high-level scientific research. Where did this come from? This really started during World War II. This is a relatively, I don't want to say it's recent, it's already been almost 80 years, but this really started during World War II. And it started really at three different universities. It started at Johns Hopkins, at the University of California, and at MIT. And it really all goes back to MIT. You always kind of have to come back to MIT. That man on the left is Vannevar Bush. He was the dean of engineering at MIT, and he really had a certain vision for what a really research-intensive American university could look like, particularly in the applied sciences and the engineering sciences, in a way that was where Hopkins had really figured this out in the biomedical sciences, but Bush was pushing this in the engineering. Bush was brought down to Washington, D.C. during the Second World War by Franklin Roosevelt to head up something called the OSRD, the Office of Scientific Research and Development. And Bush began, there was an understanding that there were some really serious applied scientific problems that needed to be solved if the US was to gain an upper hand in the war. One of the very first problems had to do with radar. We had long wave radar, but we didn't have good and usable short wave radar. And you can't really use long wave radar for fine resolution of your targets. You really need short wave radar. And immediately that work started getting done up at MIT. The entire Department of Electrical Engineering was detailed over to something called the Rad Lab. And they also pulled up an independent lab in Harriman, New York from Alfred Loomis was literally running it out of his mansion. By 1942, virtually the entire electrical engineering faculty of MIT was working on short-term radar through the Rad Lab. By 1945, at the peak of this, they had 4,000 people working at MIT at the Rad Lab. So this began to set this template of a massive government research-funded effort being run and organized at a university level. This was really where the template was established. Federal funding, but being run through and organized by university-based researchers. And it was very, very successful. There's the Manhattan Engineering District. We've all heard of the Manhattan Project. There on the left is General Leslie Groves, who was the Army general in charge of developing the atomic bomb. And that's J. Robert Oppenheimer standing next to him. We all know about it. We've all seen the movie, and many of us have read the books. And the Manhattan Engineering District was really three locations. It was Los Alamos, we've all heard of, down in New Mexico, where they actually assembled and tested the bomb. It was Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where uranium was concentrated into U-235. We needed to get the isotope of uranium, which can actually undergo fission, which is U-235. It's only about 0.5% of naturally occurring uranium. So uranium has to be enriched to about 50 to 60% U-235 to create a bomb. And that was work that was done in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And then at the same time, we were trying a different strategy of creating a plutonium-based bomb. And that work was being done up in Richland, Washington on the Columbia River at the Hanford Complex. In the end, we in fact managed to produce one of each kind of bomb. Our first bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima was a uranium-based bomb. And our second bomb that we dropped on Nagasaki was a plutonium-based bomb. They both worked. And it really seemed we can have all sorts of ethical conversations about whether or not this was the right thing to do, but it certainly ended the war. Japan surrendered 3 days after the Nagasaki bomb was dropped. It's worth noting that we only had 2 bombs. There were no more bombs left. We had really exhausted our supply of bombs. But what I really want to hammer for the sake of today's talk is that this whole thing was actually run out of the University of California. J. Robert Oppenheimer was a professor in the physics department at Cal. And to this day, Los Alamos is an arm of the University of California. And Oak Ridge actually had some cooperation with the University of Tennessee. But this whole effort was essentially a child of the University of California, funded by the Army and ultimately under the command of the Army, but essentially operationalized by the University of California. And it's really critical to realize that the work done on radar was done through MIT, and the work done on the atom bomb was done through the University of California. And the last which I'll just say right here because I don't have the pictures, was the work done on the proximity fuse, which also wound up being a critical piece of our wartime victory. That is a fuse that allowed armaments to explode upon approximation of the target as opposed to upon contact with the target. That was done at what is today the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins. What became that gargantuan 9,000 person physics lab was actually created during the Second World War. So it was these three universities, Cal, MIT, and Hopkins, that really created the genesis of this university government science nexus, this model of government funding, often under the Department of the Army or the Department of the Navy, flowing into universities. After the war, we had to decide what to do with the Manhattan Engineering District. We could have drawn down the whole thing and disassembled it, but in fact, we decided to maintain it, and the entire Manhattan Engineering District was turned over to the Atomic Energy Commission in 1947. There's David Lilienthal. Yes, he was in the movie. He was the first executive director. Brian McMahon was the senator from Connecticut who wrote the legislation creating the Atomic Energy Commission. Bernard Brook is sort of a strange guy, but he actually wrote the Brook Plan, in which there was some question about whether or not we should share atomic energy with the world, and Brook argued vociferously against it. He said, let's keep it to ourselves. There's the NIH. The NIH actually had a slightly separate history. It actually started back in the 1930s, but it grew up rapidly after the Second World War, again, as we expanded federal funding to the universities in the aftermath of the war. There's that bottom picture is Eisenhower getting off his helicopter to go visit the NIH as we were expanding the NIH and building various buildings. And I love that quote from Eisenhower because I think it really suggests something that I want to bring up in about 5 minutes, which is why this relationship is so productive. It's not obvious that it would be so productive, but why? And Eisenhower says, they are the fruits of the world's greatest research enterprise. It knows no partisanship, no dictator, or no ruler. They are all aimed at just one thing, just one goal, a better, freer, happier, healthier life for all people. And the reason I want you to take that quote away, not because it's a little bit maudlin and purple, but rather because it speaks to the intrinsic drive of research. And I really want to hammer this home because I think it's why this relationship works so well. Scientists and researchers are sort of their own breed. Many of you are in research, and you know that the kinds of things that drive scientists is, I think it's more akin to what drives artists, which is to say that if you're an artist, if you've chosen to make your life in art, you have an intrinsic need, an intrinsic urge to create art. You don't create art in the morning because you think you're going to change the world or because you think you're going to make money. You create art in the world because you have an urge to create. And I would say the same thing is true with scientific research. You don't create scientific research because you necessarily think you're going to change the world or because you're going to get famous or because you're going to get rich. You find the act of pursuing research intrinsically satisfying and compelling. And I think it's very important to understand that the intrinsic quality, the intrinsic nature of very good research and scientific research particularly, because we're going to see why it doesn't fit neatly into a government bureaucracy, why we've had to cordon off and buffer the researchers from federal bureaucracy, why this relationship actually works so very, very well. Let's take a look at a few more slides. At the same time that we were creating the Atomic Energy Commission, it took us a little while to create the National Science Foundation. That was going to fund basic science in the physical sciences. The NIH was already doing it in the biomedical sciences. Because it took us, there was actually some debate over the National Science Foundation, exactly who it should answer to, how much independence it should have. We always see this tension of independence. On one hand, the taxpayers would like to see accountability. On the other hand, scientists tend to not want to be particularly accountable to their funders. They want a lot of independence. While we were putting together the National Science Foundation, there was such a need for funding of research in the physical sciences that the Office of Naval Research, through the Naval Research Labs, actually stepped into that role in the late 1940s and early 1950s. There's Alan Waterman, who was the director of research at the Office of Naval Research, who eventually became the founding director of the National Science Foundation. The Office of Naval Research continues to fund an enormous amount of work, both basic and applied work, in weapon systems, defense, physics. A lot of the MIT budget, in fact, flows off of the Office of Naval Research. And they were the group that actually finally put together the National Science Foundation in 1948. Those were the two senators that were fighting about it. It came out of a report actually written by Vannevar Bush in 1945, where he argued what we've done during the war has been so successful with the Manhattan Engineering District and the Rad Lab at MIT. Let's continue this. This is what the next century will look like. and let's keep pushing federal funding into the universities. That's where we've had so much luck. I want to stop for a second because let's talk for 1 minute about why this relationship is so uniquely productive, why it's so good. So let me start by saying you can't do good science without a lot of money. Science just costs a lot of money. And there's just a limit to how much you can balance science, that you can piggyback science on the backs of tuition. Traditionally, students paid tuition and professors taught students. That's how they actually made their living. And then when they had a little bit of spare time, maybe they got a reduction of a half a day a week, maybe they had some time over the summer, they did a little bit of research. But if you want to do serious research, first of all, you can't just have a professor spending his or her time at 10% or 5%. You have to have someone who's really devoted to doing research, really who's spending 60, 70, 80, 90% of his or her time on research. Second of all, as research gets hard, it gets bigger. You can't just have a lone genius working on it. We all talk about Einstein writing these papers in his, in his den in the evening after the patent office, but that's not really the way scientific research gets done in the days of very, very large research projects. You need big teams. You need administrators for the lab. You need postdocs and doctoral students. You need lab assistants. You need teams of 20, 30, 40 people. And you also sometimes need very, very expensive equipment. So a good scientist today may literally put together a budget of 8 or 10 or $12 million, right? And that's real money. No university can be channeling $10 million over to a professor who just happens to have a good idea. You can't just stand up at a faculty meeting and say, Dean, I'd like $10 million to fund me and my team for the next 4 years. Oh, and by the way, I don't want to do any teaching, right? It just doesn't work. You can't do that. And you could try to draw a little bit of money to support that person over the summer, maybe off your endowment. But to really do serious work, you have to have outside funding, a very steady stream of outside funding. And that has to come from the federal government. So I really want to hammer that home that funding research at this level is just expensive. And there's only one actor around that has that kind of money, and that's the federal government. Even the states don't have that kind of money, and certainly not the foundations. To put this in perspective, the NIH budget last year was $48 billion, and we get that year after year after year. The entire output of the Gates Foundation last year, which is by far the wealthiest private foundation, was only about $5.5 billion. So the Gates Foundation, as rich as it is, can't begin to touch the scale of the federal research effort. And then if we throw in the National Science Foundation at $9 billion and the Office of Naval Research at $10 billion and the Department of Energy, which is today's Atomic Energy Commission, another $10 billion. Now we're talking about the better part of 80 or $90 billion. And there's just simply nothing that can touch that kind of funding if we want to get that kind of investment in research. But at the same time, there's a reason we don't bring that research in-house. There's a reason that we want to take that money and channel it out to the universities. And this is why. The nature of government is bureaucracy. And I mean bureaucracy in the best sense of the word. And bureaucracy is run on accountability, right? There are metrics, there are goals that you have to meet, there are deliverables, and you have deliverables that you need to meet for your boss, and then she has to meet them for her boss, and she has to meet them for his boss, and whatever, right? And at each level, different bureaucrats and have supervisory duties, and they have to deliver, right? So there's a certain level of rigidness just embedded in bureaucracy, right? There's hierarchy and there's accountability and there's rigidness. It's the essence of bureaucracy. And at its best, it allows us to do enormous things like cut Social Security checks to 100 million Americans every week and do it for the most part pretty successfully. Or pave over, 40 million or maintain 40 million miles of federal highways, right? We have very, very big tasks that have to be done and done repeatedly and be done accountably and be done at a reasonably high level. And so that kind of rigid bureaucracy allows us to do that. But the nature of research and researchers is very, very different. The nature of research is very creative and freeform and not accountable. After all, if the federal government decides to write a $4 billion check to the state of Alabama and says, we want to see 400 miles of new highway by 4 years, every month there's a federal inspector down there looking at that highway. What have you poured? What concrete have you poured? What have you cleared? What have you paved? Where are the electricals going in? Where are the lights going in? I want to see these deliverables, and I want to see your contracts, and I want to see exactly how you're spending that money, and I want to see how many people you've hired, because we're accountable to the taxpayer ultimately, right? But a researcher has a very, very different ethos. A researcher says, give me $5 million, and I'm going to put together a team of very bright people, and we're going to look at these kinds of questions. We're going to do it very creatively, And we can't be accountable because we don't know what we're going to find. After all, the essence of research is that you don't know the answer. That's why you're doing research, right? So scientists don't work well in bureaucracy. Scientists tend to work well with a lot of latitude and a lot of independence and a lot of trust and very, very flat organization where they can communicate across the organization. They can talk to their colleagues, they can go to meetings, they can communicate their findings. So they're very, very different cultures. And I want to emphasize that one culture is not superior to another culture, but they're designed to accomplish different tasks. And if you try to take basic research and put it into a bureaucratic framework, it falls very flat. And if you try to get a bunch of scientists to actually run a highway department, it'll be a disaster, right? You really need two different skill sets. And yet the scientists need the federal funding. And so this is why we've developed the system of federal funding to independent university-based scientists. It's been a wonderful marriage. And I just can't emphasize that enough, how successful this marriage has been. It's been by far the most successful marriage of institutions in the world in terms of producing high-quality research year after year after year. One or two more slides, then we'll finish up. And then I know there's questions out there. We've created all sorts of relationships. One kind of relationship we've created are these national laboratories that are actually funded. They used to be funded out of the Atomic Energy Commission, and since the 70s, they've been funded out of the Department of Energy. These are large research consortiums where we do research in particle physics and theoretical physics. One of the reasons we do this is because to do this kind of research, we need a huge particle accelerator. That is an enormous cyclotron, we need a research reactor and a huge cyclotron. And these things are very, very expensive, tens of billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars to build. No university can do this. And so the federal government has to fund this through the Department of Energy. But in each case, we've done it in conjunction, as was true in the Second World War, with universities. So there's the Argonne Lab out there west of Chicago, and it is operated by the University of Chicago. And there's the Lawrence Berkeley Lab that is run by the University of California. And there's Oak Ridge that is run by the University of Tennessee. Here in the Northeast, we do things a little bit differently. We do have a major national laboratory at Brookhaven on Long Island. It's actually run by a consortium of universities, one of which is Columbia. So it's a consortium of about 20 Northeast research universities that feed into Brookhaven. But so each of these national labs, and there are more, I'm just showing you some of them, has a university partner. So the funding comes from the federal government, but the operation comes out of the universities. These are what I call the quasi-national labs. These look a lot like a national lab, but they're not actually funded by the Department of Energy. They're funded by something else. So that upper right-hand corner is the Applied Physics Lab that's funded out of the Department of Defense, and it's run by Hopkins. The upper left-hand corner is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the JPL, which is run out of NASA. It used to be run out of the Air Force, now it's run out of NASA, and that's run by Caltech. There's Lincoln Labs at MIT, which is funded through the Air Force, and there is the Forrestal campus at Princeton, which is funded out of the Navy and out of the Department of Energy and is run jointly by both Princeton and Penn, mostly Princeton. I always like to say when you're driving down Route 1 and you get to Princeton, you just drove by half of Princeton. Half of Princeton was 10 miles up the road behind gates guarded by Marines, and that was the Forrestal campus. And that's where half of the Princeton budget is going. No student ever goes there unless you're a postdoc or a doctoral student. And certainly when they give you tours of campus, they're not showing it to you because it's all classified. But that's actually half of the Princeton budget is 10 miles up the road at the Forrestal campus. Let me get out of here for 1 second. So that's what we've had. We've had this extraordinary, successful marriage. We are now seriously throwing this marriage into question. It's not foretold. This marriage is only about 70 years old. It has had both pluses and minuses. The plus has been that it's allowed us to do an enormous amount of highly effective research. The minus has been that it's concentrated academic talent at about 20 or 25 universities, right? Scientists like to be with other scientists, and very good scientists like to be with other very good scientists. So the nature of high quality research is to aggregate talent. And that is actually part of what we've seen in this country, where although we have many, many fine colleges, there are about 25 or 30 universities in this country which draw almost 80% of all federal funding. So when we talk about what this administration is doing to Columbia or doing to Harvard or possibly maybe to Michigan, and someone says, does this affect CUNY? And I teach at CUNY. And my answer is, no, 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 no. We're not part of that game. That's a rich kid's game. That's really a game that only affects about 24 or so universities. That's good and bad. It produces very high quality research. It also distorts the balance of distribution of talent around this country, which may be a problem. And it actually may be part of what's leading to some of the anger nationwide, that there's a sense that there's a handful of very, very elite institutions that are funded heavily by taxpayers that effectively become gatekeepers of elite leadership. And that many Americans feel that they have no access to these institutions. My kid can't get into Princeton. My kid can't get into the University of Michigan. My kid isn't going to go to college. How do I benefit? How does my family benefit from having this wealth of talent concentrated up there at Ann Arbor or over there at the University of Washington or down there at UC Davis or whatever it may be? It's also to some degree distorted, not surprisingly, it's a little bit distorted our research enterprise, which is when government is writing the checks, at some degree, what's the old line? The piper calls the fiddler's tune. Whoever pays the bill calls the fiddler's tune. You pay what you're being paid to, and a researcher to some degree. They don't answer lockstep to a funder, but they at least have to focus their research on the kinds of questions that the funder finds interesting. So it's to some degree, it's pushed our research specifically toward applied research in the biomedical sciences to solve various diseases, and also toward defense-related research, for better or worse. I think I want to stop there. This gives us about 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I could talk more about a lot of this, but I hope I've given you at least something to chew on.
You've given us more than something to chew on. This has been really wonderful. And I want to encourage our very large audience to please submit questions in the Q&A box. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. But I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask you, Jonathan, you've discussed these issues around the freedom to define, explore scientific questions on the part of scientists. And that's really been, as you say, fundamental to research excellence in this country. But of course, we are seeing increasingly that NIH and NSF are the scope of inquiry is being narrowed by administration's priorities. And I just want to mention today a piece that has just come out that's hot off the presses by Alondra Nelson, who of course was our Dean of Social Science here at Columbia, and served as Deputy Director of Science and Society at the Office of Science and Technology Policy until 2022. She's now at the Institute of Advanced Studies, but she came out with this piece in Time Magazine today entitled "Why I'm Resigning from Positions at the National Science Foundation and the Library of Congress." And what she describes in this really powerful piece is the creeping normalization of authoritarian approaches to knowledge management and academic freedom. And she's warning that the hollowing out of scientific governance, as she writes, really has downstream consequences for the integrity of knowledge, biomedical knowledge, scientific knowledge itself. And I'm wondering if you could spend a little bit of time just talking about this tension between what she refers to as knowledge management and academic freedom,
Sure.
and what the implications are for
Sure.
your research.
It's a good question, Sandra. There's always a tension, right? I mean, what researchers want is freedom. They want a carte blanche, a blank check to go and pursue the questions that they find interesting. And I really do believe in the integrity of the research enterprise and the moral stature of researchers. These are people who, they're wired a little bit differently. They're really not running after money. They really find the task of answering basic questions very, very compelling. So they really don't want someone telling them what to do and what questions to ask, and certainly not what data to find. At the same time, people who write checks fairly have a right to say, look, I'm interested in these questions. My wife is suffering from breast cancer, and I'm willing to put $20 million into research, but I'd kind of like you to focus on breast cancer. I'm not going to tell you exactly what questions to ask. I'm not going to tell you how to conduct your research, but I'd like you to be generally associated with working toward a cure for breast cancer. So it's a dance, right? It's a dance. And a researcher may say, that's totally uninteresting to me. It's not a good fit. Or I think that I can tailor, I'm interested in basic protein folding, or I'm basically interested in intermediary molecules within this particular sequence, but that's not inconsistent with breast cancer research. And I think we can make a deal. I think I can take your money in good faith. And I think my work long-term will work to the benefit of those suffering breast cancer. We don't know exactly how, but it's not totally unconnected. So there's a dance there. And I started to say, Sandra, when we were putting the National Science Foundation together, it took us a couple of years. And the fight was over how independent the NSF was going to be from the White House. Truman at the time said, it's going to be taxpayer money. I want the NSF accountable to the taxpayers. And Bush said, the more accountable you make it, the worse the quality of science is going to be. So that's just not the way scientists work. Scientists don't run for office. That's not the way it works. And we had to have a compromise. So what we have actually is an executive appointed director of the NSF, but an advisory board that's actually self-perpetuating, that's drawn from the scientific community, albeit with the veto power of the White House. So it's a dance. It really is a dance. One of the and it's reasonable for taxpayers to question the use of their money. Should we really be funding this? Should we really be funding that? That's not unreasonable. The question is how far we go. So this simply for the federal government or for Congress or the White House to say, we're calling into question this. This research seems a little stupid or a little cocky, or it seems to be antithetical toward our national interests. That's a reasonable thing to say. It's quite another thing to say, this is the research we want to do, and even worse, this is the data we want you to produce. That's when we really get corruption, when we start saying, it's not just that we're going to dictate what question you ask, we're going to dictate how you answer that question. That's when we have truly corrupted science. Are we there yet? It's too soon to know. I mean, we're having a really odd national temper tantrum over Harvard and Columbia specifically, and I don't actually quite trust the rhetoric around this. It's not clear to me why these two universities have been singled out. It's not clear to me what the administration actually really wants, and nor is it clear to me that the voters who supported this administration really wanted this. One of the odd things about scientific research is it's tended to be historically nonpartisan. Everybody wants to cure cancer, right? Everybody wants to put someone on the moon. This is really exciting. So it's very weird that this is now breaking down along partisan lines. And I'm actually not convinced that it is. I think the White House may have misread the electorate. And I don't think that we're seeing enormous popular support for some of these cuts that are being proposed. But that said, certainly an awful lot of people in the universities are very frightened about what they're hearing right now.
Great. I know that we don't have a lot of time, so I'm gonna combine a couple of the questions that we have in the Q&A box, but I just want to alert to, folks that we do have
The
an
after
after
party.
party discussion Zoom room. The link will appear in the chat at the close of our session, but there is a question about how these changes in research funding is impacting the healthcare system more explicitly. And I know this is an area of expertise for you, but just if you could speak a little bit about the shifts that we're seeing now with respect to the research, how it actually will feed into or cascade into
So
health.
this is actually complicated. But with healthcare specifically, the federal government tends to fund basic research. And then the pharmaceutical firms tend to fund applied research. And this has actually been a long simmering sore because the pharmaceutical companies are piggybacking off of publicly funded research and then creating applied research, which is then patentable, where they own the intellectual property and where returns accrue to the private sector, right? And again, there's an interesting dance where what Merck or Pfizer might say is, look, this stuff was published, it was funded under a federal grant, but anyone was free to use it, right? We're not taking ownership of this research. Anybody could have started a pharmaceutical company and taken ownership of this. So right now, what we're talking about is cuts to basic research, and we won't see the ramifications of cuts to basic research for many years. It takes an awfully long time to translate basic results into applied therapeutics, right, to therapeutic interventions. It can take decades until some basic insight or discovery actually produces a cure. We're still trying to work on recombinant DNA, right? It's taken 40, 50 years since the discovery of DNA for us to actually try to figure out how to manipulate DNA, and we're still not very good at it. So it takes an awfully long time. I don't think we're going to see a decline in American health as a result of these cuts anytime soon. I think the old line used to be, and this is not my line, we're eating our seed corn, right? So every year a farmer has to keep a little bit of corn for next year. During a really harsh winter, maybe you wind up eating that corn, and it feels good in December. The problem is that next April rolls around, you don't have any seed corn there. You haven't been able to seed the next generation. And that's the fear, is that by cutting this kind of research, we're dissuading young people from starting research careers, which will then ultimately produce the next the next tranche of scientific breakthroughs, which 20, 30, 40 years down the line might produce higher quality life for us and for this planet. But I think we're talking about a long time horizon.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for such a great presentation. And to the audience, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. We are going to port those questions over to our after party discussion, and you'll get the link in just a moment. Again, this recording will be available on the Columbia Division of Ethics website. This concludes this year's Ethics Grand Rounds for the academic year. We're going to start up again in September. So in the meantime, if you'd like, you can subscribe to our mailing list to stay up to date with our events. There will be a brief survey that will automatically pop up on your screen when the webinar ends. We really would love your comments and suggestions. We take them seriously, and it helps us plan our future events. And then finally, I think you should have that link in the chat if you would like to join us for our 30-minute more informal discussion in our Zoom room. So we hope to see you on the other side. And for those of you who are leaving us, we really appreciate you joining us, and we wish you a good rest of your week. Thank you.